Greetings, my fellow citizens of Metropolis, even if only in our hearts, and welcome back to Unrepentant Geeking, the show where a geek can be a geek. My God, it's been a while, hasn't it? Yeah, I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, got sick, this time infection of throat, could not talk for weeks, and even after that, doctor wouldn't let me record. Ugh, it was a whole goddamn thing. You know, just as I'm finally starting to get a handle on my work schedule and recording and doing stuff, I get struck down with one hell of an infection, and yeah. But hopefully the dark days are over, and I can finally begin completing what has been a long-delayed Patreon request, and that is taking a look at 3 very different, yet not so different, origins of, well, the world's first superhero. Yes, Superman, the Man of Steel, the Man of Tomorrow, the Metropolis Yeah, we can't use that word around DC characters anymore. They get all chicken about it, and it's not a good time for anybody involved. But yes, I am now beginning a 3-part series where I will be taking a look at 3 attempts to reboot, redo, reunify, whatever you want to call it, the origin of Superman. I'll be talking about the Man of Steel, the comic, not the movie, as I'll be saying several times, Birthright, and Secret Origins. So, these will be taking place over, hopefully, 3, maybe 4 weeks. I got a couple game reviews coming up, which could get in the way. But regardless, before the end of February, definitely, you will see me tackle the origin of Superman thrice. That is right, thrice over. I think thrice means 3? Let's just pretend it does and move on with our lives. And so, without further ado, let us begin. So let us begin by talking about Superman's origin. If you've been following my show for a long time, you probably know that I have very strong feelings at this point about doing origin stories for 3 characters ever again in any medium, other than comic books. I'll still allow them there. Those 3 characters are Batman, Spider-Man, and Superman. It's just, I cringe at the thought of spending more than 5 minutes at any time in a TV series or a movie or whatever detailing these 3 characters' origins, because Jesus Christ, who doesn't know Batman's origin at this point? Who doesn't know Superman's origin? Who doesn't know Spider-Man's origin? Especially since how many movies have we now spent in the last 20 years on it? And these are 3 of the most well-known, recognizable characters in history, ever. Not just modern pop culture, not just modern culture, but all of the history of culture. I really do think that even if civilization collapses tomorrow, 100 years from now, the remains of humanity will still on some level remember Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man. They have entered into the public consciousness so much. It's like that one good scene from that terrible movie, Reign of Fire, where in this post-apocalyptic society where humanity's been reduced to the very dregs and there's no technology, we see a group of older characters performing for the surviving children upon a stage. The big scene from Empire Strikes Back where Vader reveals he's Luke's father, because Star Wars is such a cultural touchstone at this point, yes. And I believe the same thing would be true for Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man. And look, I don't want to go too much into bashing Man of Steel, the movie, just because I've done that plenty before, and it feels redundant at this point. We've got to see where things go with the next movie, and yada, yada, yada. But one of my biggest problems with Man of Steel was just that we spent so much of that movie detailing the origin. And I'll get into not just Superman's origin, but Krypton, and it all just, no, why are you doing this? Detailing these characters' origins at this point, spending, like I said, more than 5 minutes. And actually, I feel that way about most superhero characters. Like, look at Guardians of the Galaxy. We get a bit on Star-Lord's backstory to open the movie. We spend like 5 minutes on it, and then we move forward. Yes, technically Guardians of the Galaxy is the origin of how the team comes together, but that's different from spending an hour going over each character's backstory. Instead, the movie shows us these characters and unveils moments throughout. I think at this point you could probably do that with most superhero movies. I don't really know how detailed you need to go with the origin. People get the basic idea, and you can fill in the details along the way, but that's especially true with these 3 characters. So you would think that means I absolutely hate the 3 comics we're about to cover. I mean, one of them spends 12 issues giving us Superman's origin. And yet that's not the case, and the reason is, it's the limitations of the medium. You see, with film, every minute counts. But there's also just something to the idea that after so many years, we're finally at a point where we can make superhero movies that can be true to the source material, that can give us the kind of visuals, the kind of crazy, glorious insanity that makes superhero comics so much fun on the big screen. And I don't want to waste any more time getting to the fireworks factory, especially when it isn't necessary. When almost anybody on the street can tell you the origin of Spider-Man. Oh, he gets bit by a radioactive spider. His uncle dies. Batman. Oh, his parents get killed. Superman. Oh, he comes from an exploding planet. You know, we know that shit. We know it so well that little kids who have never actually read a comic book, 3-year-olds could probably tell you the origin of these characters. Because it's so ingrained into our society. Let's get to the good stuff. Especially with somebody like Superman, who, well, let's just say, I understand why people love the Christopher Reeve movies, and I'm not... Alright, I am here to talk against them a little bit, I guess. That's what I'm doing right now. But it's not that I think they're necessarily bad movies. They're just not my kind of movies, and they suffer from the limitations of the time. And look, for the time, yes, you'll believe a man can fly, and they're fine. They're an excellent... They're an okay expression of the Silver Age concept of Superman, but I want modern Superman, because that's my Superman. I want a Superman, I want that Superman, and I've never really gotten it. I'd hoped so much Man of Steel would be it. No. And I don't want to see Batman's origin again. I want to see you give me Adventures with Batman in live action, because I think that's neat. I think that's interesting. It's not that I wanted to replace it. There's so many great Batman cartoons and comics and books and video games. But I love to see stories retold effectively in different mediums. I think that's exciting and fun. And when you do it right, it can say something new about the characters. It can bring new dimensions to them. And we don't need to waste 40 minutes on Krypton. We don't need to spend half the damn movie anymore retelling Spider-Man's origin. We can just get on with it. And if we spend an hour getting up to the point where Peter gets his powers and just recounting things we know, that's boring in film. But it's also unnecessary, because if I want to see the early days, or if I want to see the origins of these characters, I'll go to the comic books for that. And I think comics are much better suited for that. But more than that, each of these 3 books were not just meant to be standalone stories. They were meant to be jumping off points. They were meant to be reestablishing the backstory, the background of this character of Superman. And not just in the sense of who he was, but also who he is and who he's going to be. And so in that sense, when you are trying to create the definitive, and since we have 3 definitive origins of Superman that we're covering, that word doesn't exactly have the same meaning in comic books, but you know what I'm saying. These are meant to be the building blocks of a universe, so I think there's value in that, but I also just... The best moments of all 3 of these comics are the moments when we get to see who Superman is. And they can take time, in a way that a film can't, to really delve into the character, to show how who he was is informing who he is. And so I do think there is more room in comics, especially when you have 6 or 12 issues, to carry off the story. And it just comes down to the translation in medium. I don't mind taking my time and seeing a slower burn in a comic, in the same way that I don't mind a novel spending, 200 pages giving us backstory and looking into a character's head and laying out small details. There's room for that in these kind of mediums that there isn't necessarily in film, or even possibly TV. TV, has a bit of a middle ground because it's stretched out more, but even then, it comes down to storytelling and what is effective in one medium versus another, as I've said several times. And when you're doing it in film, you're overloading the audience, and you're not really telling the story, you're telling the backstory, and you don't necessarily have to. You look at the original Star Wars. You look at The Force Awakens. Now, I've said we could have used a little more detail in The Force Awakens, but still, you can get by watching either of those movies, and you know, if you never know anything else about Star Wars, you could watch either, you know, the first Star Wars film or The Force Awakens, and you can follow along, and you can enjoy what is, a more or less, not as much in Force Awakens by design, but still, more or less a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end, and you don't need to know the reams and reams of backstory. And that's because film is very effective at showing. That is the greatest strength of film. Even more than comic books. Because film will also have, comic books, it's a visual medium to some degree, yes, but it's a static one. While film, in addition to the visuals, can also have the strength of the actors and their performances. It can have the directing using cinematography in a way that comics can't. It has music. It has sound effects. There's a lot more tools in its arsenal to make the visuals just part of a larger whole in a way that comics aren't. And it really, just having characters in what is meant to be a big action movie spend 20 minutes sitting around just pointlessly filling in backstory details in a way that isn't interesting or entertaining is a waste of time. And so, yeah, I guess maybe I'm being a little hypocritical, but I also I'm tired of seeing us spend so much time in movies going over Spider-Man's origin when what I really want is to see Peter swinging around the city, balancing all the troubles of his life, shooting out webs, cracking wise, getting in over his head, barely surviving battles against the bad guys. And also, it takes away time the movie could use to make it a more complete film. I mean, one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, of the last set of Spider-Man movies, those two movies, is they were so caught up trying to set up a cinematic universe and trying to create new connections for Peter's backstory and trying to juggle so many masters, they just couldn't tell very satisfying individual stories in their own right, and there's far more room in comics to do that. So, that is basically why I'm okay with the idea of periodically revisiting these characters' origins. And I also think that there's something to be said for the fact that, in theory, you are telling the stories of these characters across decades and decades. Not, obviously, the same story. Now, what with new writers and artists and creative directions and all that sorts of stuff. It's hardly been one continuous line for Superman, and it was hardly one continuous line even before the New 52, but still, the idea that you do have these series of stories that, to some degree or another, whether in terms of continuity or just creatively, are building on one another, and so periodically you need to go back in, clear out the clutter that no longer works, the stuff that no longer fits, that feels awkward today in a way that it didn't yesterday, or would be better if tweaked in a different direction, and make things cleaner, smoother, more enjoyable. And with that thought in mind, let's actually talk about Man of Steel. And just to be clear, I am talking about the John Byrne comic. This was a 6-issue miniseries that came out between July and September of 1986. This is not the movie. Now, the movie did take a few elements for this. It took a few elements, actually, from all 3 of the series we're going to be covering to some degree or another. But yeah, this was a big deal at the time. It really is hard to state enough how much of a big deal Man of Steel was. What it comes down to is, this was in the aftermath of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the infamous series that ended the DC universe that was, and launched what would be at the time the new modern DC universe. Gone was the multiverse. In its place was a single world, a single continuity, all these characters, because it's for newer comic readers, you may not realize that once upon a time, characters like Blue Beetle and characters like Captain Marvel, aka Shazam, whatever you want to call him, and so on, and even the Justice Society characters, they existed off in their own universes. They weren't part of the main DC line, and they did have their own ongoing series in some cases, but they you had these distinct universes. There wasn't technically, like in the background of the mainline DC universe, a World War II set of superheroes. Instead, Superman just showed up and he was the first, and all that stuff. Crisis changed all that, brought everything together, and would remain the status quo for a very long time with changes along the way, but finally ending in the New 52, which changed everything kind of back in a way. It's all a whole mess. Let's not delve too much into that. But yes, it was a new era for DC Comics, and in a lot of ways, what they really wanted to do was to take what was seen largely as one of their 2 flagship characters, along with Batman. They wanted to take both of those characters, and they wanted to give them fresh new origins. They wanted to tighten everything up, because that was the thing. There really wasn't what we think of today, in the modern sense, a DC universe. I mean, there was. Technically, a lot of these characters all existed in the same multiverse, and especially during the Silver Age, though, continuity was a much more iffy thing. Not the least of which because, well, comics were seen as a disposable medium. They were seen as something that you had your audience for, and they'd stick with you for 5 years or so, something along that length of time, and then they'd stop. They'd just stop altogether. They wouldn't ever look back at comics of these characters. They'd grow out of it, and they'd move on to other things. For a long time, following the whole Seduction of Innocence Comics Code debacle, which basically went a long way to destroy comic books as a major cultural force in the United States. I mean, yes, these characters lingered, superhero characters lingered. They had enough drive and pull, and they've managed to drag themselves back up into relevancy in a way today. But that took a long time, and it took things like the movies that we're seeing now, and the TV series, for it to really take effect. You have to understand that before all the Seduction of Innocence stuff, there was a time when comics were just this huge, huge deal, where everybody read comics, where it wasn't just superheroes. You had horror, you had crime, you had comics for women, you had comics for men, you had comics for a whole range of ages. You had comics that were definitely not for kids. And that all changed going into the Silver Age because of the Comics Code, because of the whole, well, comics are dangerous for kids kind of thing. It's the same kind of ordeal that video games constantly face now. And it's one of the reasons why, gamer like me gets very nervous when I see stuff like that, because I'm also, I know enough about history, about comic book history, and about other mediums and so on. It can all get pulled out from under us if we let it and if we're not careful. Regardless, in the Silver Age, comics were very much a disposable medium, to the point that DC would regularly reprint old stories in new issues. Like, you'd get a story from, I don't know, I'm making up random numbers just for the hell of it, Action Comics 252, you'd get the exact same story reprinted, 60 issues later. And I mean the exact same story. No changes usually made, maybe occasionally a new title, maybe, if they were feeling really energetic, they'd give a framing device and some sort of explanation for why they're recounting this story, but most of the time they didn't even bother to do that. They would just reprint the same story, they'd put a new cover on the issue, but beyond that, it's the exact same story. And they knew they could get away with that because 90% of the audience were not reading comics back then, and the audience who were gone. That was the way it was. That was the way things were treated. It was a disposable medium. It was something that you got into for a time, and then you moved on with your life. And as such, you also got a very loose approach often to continuity. Not that there weren't exceptions, even in DC. And I don't want to paint it, the Silver Age is all bad. There were some good stories to come out of that, and some good Superman stories. I remember this one classic one where he gets thrown into the future, where so far into the future that the Earth's sun has gone red, which isn't really scientific. Well, who cares? And he's wandering this just hellish kind of, dying landscape where humanity has long since died out. Nothing is around anymore. There's almost no life. And it's just Superman without any powers. And he stumbles upon the remains. He stumbles upon a city filled with androids of people from Metropolis who are his friends. Why? Who cares? Who cares? Does that make any sense? No, but it actually is a very effective story. I remember it really captures this sense of loneliness and strangeness and pathos. It really does, because Superman feels like he's trapped. This is it. He's never going to be able to get back. He doesn't have his powers. There's nobody else to talk to. I mean, again, that doesn't seem very likely in light of a modern DC universe, where even that far in the future, you'd think there'd still be other civilizations out there in space, but fine. It works in this context. But it also meant that there's a reason, people used to hate Lois Lane. There's a reason that she used to be seen as this shrew, or that super dickery is a term, because Silver Age was just throwing shit at the wall to see what would stick, because nobody, I don't want to say nobody cared, but it wasn't important for there to be consistency. It wasn't important necessarily for the characters to be likable, because this was seen, well, the audience are just kids, and they're dumb, right? Who cares? Kids will just read it and eat it up, and kids hate girls, right? And it was for boys, especially. Oh, we can't make Lois too likable, although Lois had her own book. I mean, what I am making are very, 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 very gross simplifications and generalizations here, okay? There are exceptions, lots of exceptions to this. I'm trying to establish what was going on before, okay? And there wasn't a lot of consistency. You would constantly, especially in something like, you'd see it in The Flash, Green Lantern, you just see ideas thrown at the wall, changes made to backstories. So while there were lots of retcons over the years in Superman's character and his story, they often weren't very consistent. Now, got into the 70s, and as you got closer to Crisis, that did begin to change, and there was more attempt to make a cohesive universe, but by that point, things were just so cluttered and messy and haphazard that a lot of those attempts failed. Get weird creative changes. Like there was an idea for at one point to get rid of kryptonite for whatever reason, because apparently Superman wasn't overpowered enough, and they did this whole ridiculous story where all kryptonite is destroyed, and then a few months later realized, whoops, that's not a great idea, and so they brought it back in a haphazard way as well, and it just, yeah. You could see the seams all the time, and there wasn't that much effort to make the seams invisible. So that was things going into Crisis, and coming out, DC saw the opportunity to make things more cohesive, more coherent, and so they charged John Byrne, and this was a John Byrne, these days, if you don't know, John Byrne is he's a bit of a fallen idol for most people. He used to be one of the greatest creators, in the 80s, he was this amazing, unbelievable, influence. He had this huge impact on both Marvel and DC, an impact that at its time was every bit the match of a Frank Miller, another fallen idol, or a Chris Claremont. Yeah, fallen again too, though to a lesser extent than those two, I to be fair. But whatever, at the time, they were gods of comics. And so, you had Byrne coming off of years of doing stuff with Marvel, coming into DC in a big way. And you also had DC who knew that they wanted to simplify things. They wanted to make Superman special again. They wanted to make him more manageable. And there were a couple of key things they wanted to hit. And they actually went to writers like Frank Miller, Steve Gerber, and Marv Wolfman, and they all had their pitches. None of them were going through, even though they all wanted the same thing. They wanted to get rid of Superboy, and with good reason, because Superboy is a really stupid concept. The idea that Superman was running around in this little town, because that was the idea of Superboy at the time. He was just Smallville bound most of the time. And that he was, apparently there's enough, crime in this tiny city of Smallville, enough superpowered craziness for Superman to be for Superboy to have a full-time job as a superhero. But even worse, that, he would be this active character who would even meet Lex Luthor, who would have all these villains he'd meet in the past, and would operate as that at the same time as Clark Kent, and then would move to Metropolis at the same time as Clark Kent. And yeah, Superboy is very much the kind of Silver Age thing where it only works if you don't think about it too much, and you're just, if you take the MST3K approach. And that's not, it's just a movie I really need to relax, and that's not always a bad thing, but they wanted something more believable. They also wanted to cut back Superman's powers, because by this point, Superman could literally sneeze, and if he sneezed wrong, he could destroy an entire solar system. That's actually something that happened, it's talked about in the comics. And they wanted to change Lex Luthor, they wanted to completely revamp him, but most importantly, they wanted to make Superman the only survivor of Krypton again. Because by this point, you had Supergirl, and you had, you had a super monkey, for the love of God. You had a monkey, not just Krypto, who I do love Krypto, but you didn't just get Krypto, for the love of God. You had a monkey, and a horse, and a cat, and it felt like that there were survivors of Krypton showing up every other issue, because sometimes they were. It was just like you're starting to wonder, were Superman's parents the only one who did actually die on Krypton? So they wanted to cut back all of that. They wanted to cut the fat, but none of the pitches that were made quite worked, and then they went to John Byrne, and he just left Marvel, and he agreed, and he presented DC with a proposal which they were so happy with. They apparently, they went along with 99% of what he said. There was like a small change, I don't even remember what it was at this point, that they wanted. But basically, his idea was accepted, and it was agreed. He'd be the lead writer of Superman going forward. At this point, there'd be some other Superman books, but he'd be the one really, for the immediate future, driving Superman forward. He'd be telling new stories set in the present, but first, he had to set up everything. And the big deal about Man of Steel was, as far as I know, I really think this was the first, at least from the big two, really kind of major focused revamp of a character like this. I mean, there had been changes before, obviously. You look at what Frank Miller would go on to do with Daredevil, although I think, he during his run, he certainly tweaked it, and then he would eventually go on to do Man Without Fear. That wouldn't come around until 1993, and indeed, things like Man Without Fear were born largely from Man of Steel, from the fact that Byrne showed you could do this, and also, to be fair, also from Miller's own Batman Year One. But this was DC really trying to take an approach to really revamp in a concentrated, thoughtful way these characters and their origins in a way that would be more compatible with the more modern sensibility of comic books. With the idea that where comic books were being seen less as kid stuff, where it was meant at least as much, if eventually not more, for adults than kids. At least equally. Some will say to the detriment of the medium, and I'm not going to get into all that. This is not the time and place. And Man of Steel really stuck. Not in a way that I don't think even Year One, Batman Year One did. I mean, Batman Year One hung around in the background, but even very early on, it was already starting to get major tweaks and changes, and it was more like a general idea, and it's kind of understandable because this is sacrilege. I like Batman Year One, but it's only okay in my opinion. It's a decent start, but it always felt like to me like the first half of a larger Batman story, but it doesn't really go all the way because it does give us some details, but it doesn't really start to bring in the villains, and it doesn't really start to bring in the other side of Batman that's other parts of the character and the mythos that are just as important as the ones it covers. Man of Steel goes a lot further, and indeed, Man of Steel starts from the beginning. And so let's dig a bit into this series. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail on any of these comics. I am not going to do in-depth recaps of these series, if for no other reason than I think there's a very good chance many of you watching this have never read any of these comics. Man of Steel you may have never read because it's old and it's no longer continuity and it has its own issues. You may have never read Birthright because it got largely forgotten about, which is a real shame, as I'm going to talk about. And Secret Origins, well, it came at a weird time, basically. There's more likely some of you have read it, but then again, I don't know how many of you are actually reading Superman comics at all. So, on the off chance you haven't ever read any of these comics, I don't want to spoil them. And I know that sounds weird. I don't mean spoil the plot developments, because it is ultimately, these are all Superman's origin, and you know the basic details. Superman, distant alien planet, Mom, Pa Kent, Lex Luthor evil, because all three of these series have big roles for Lex Luthor, justifiably so. Lois Lane, intrepid reporter, all that good stuff. But what I mean by spoiling doesn't just mean, or at least it shouldn't just mean, giving away plot details. It's about ruining the experience. And there is something joyous about reading these comics for the first time. Hell, in order for this review, I had to sit down and reread all three of these comics from start to finish, and I did it over about a period of a day. And I hadn't read any of these comics, God, in years. I mean, Birthright's a favorite of mine, but even then, it's been at least 5 years since I've read it, and it was novel coming back to them after a long time. And seeing them with fresh eyes and experiencing them anew. And it was a revelation of just how much fun these are and how much I love Superman and I love his mythos. Even Secret Origins, which has elements, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to go ahead and say Secret Origins is my least favorite of the three of these. And it's also the one from Jeff Johns, and I have my issues with Jeff Johns, which I'll be touching upon. But yeah, you know what? I enjoyed all three of these a great deal. And it was really fun to see these different takes on the same character. And that's the other thing, is comics can more easily give us vastly different takes on the character, and they can give us more meandering stories that don't have to be so plot-driven in the same way that a movie does. Anyways, I like these stories. So I'm not going to go in, I'm going to try and not do just full-on recaps. I'm just going to try and address each book, the high points, and explain what I like about them and why I think they're worth reading even today. Because all three of these books are no longer continuity, for whatever that's worth. They've all been, the New 52 came and swept them all away. Now, arguably, Man of Steel had been swept away by Birthright, which was in turn swept away by Secret Origins. I'm sorry, I mean Secret Origin. The book is actually called Superman Secret Origin, but I'm going to go ahead and say I'm probably going to flip-flop between Origins regularly throughout this, because it's just too easy to say Origins instead of Origin. Origin sounds, I don't know why. So if I do, please forgive it. I'll do my best to call it Origin, but I'm probably going to slip repeatedly. Just, you know what I'm talking about. I am talking about the Jeff Johns written 6-issue miniseries that ran from September 2009 to August 2010. So if I say Secret Origins, I'm not talking about a different book. You know what I'm talking about. But let's first discuss Man of Steel. And like I said, I don't really remember anything quite like this. And yes, Birthright swept away things like that, but really, they were just changing a lot of the stuff that Byrne had established. They were just building upon it. They were making changes, but they still used a lot of the framework. The framework of Man of Steel still remained. The details changed, but the general shape of Superman's origin remained the same. And it wouldn't be until the New 52 and Grant Morrison's hideous abortion of an attempt to run on Superman, which there's a reason we're not going to be covering Grant Morrison's New 52 take on Superman, which is technically its own origin, because it's shit. Yeah, I said it. He was trying to bring Superman back to the Golden Age Superman, but the Golden Age Superman wasn't all that interesting or compelling. Or there was a reason it worked in the Golden Age and not now. And, I'm not getting into that too much. I could easily probably go an hour on. This isn't just me hating on the New 52. This is me particularly not liking Grant Morrison's take on it. But I'm wandering again. Let's get back on point. What Man of Steel really did is it secured the humanity of Superman. And that was the greatest legacy of it. And it's important to recognize how remarkable that is, because up until this point, really, Superman or Kal-El had been the real character, and Clark Kent was just the mask. I mean, not for nothing, but if you go read the classic, the final, as it were, in quotation marks, Golden Age, Silver Age, Superman story, the end of that era of Superman, of course, Alan Moore's absolute stone cold classic, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. In that book, when the Clark Kent identity is stripped away from Superman, when it's revealed that he is Superman, he doesn't really react to it that much. It's barely treated as anything at all. It's not a big deal to him that he's lost this human identity. And honestly, even the other characters don't react that much. Now, partially that's because of the needs of the story. It was only so many pages, and they were in the middle of bad things happening. But still, to me, that was the real backward element of the Silver Age take on Superman, that he was Kal-El first and Clark second, which doesn't make any sense. Because for so much of his life, he was raised as Clark Kent. His formative years were as Clark Kent. Except then you throw in Superboy, and you throw in Did He Know About Krypton, and you throw in all that, and you start to see the problem. It's not about continuity. That wasn't the issue. The issue was there was no cohesion to Superman. There was no cohesion to him as a character. And, by the time of Crisis, there had been some attempts to start to, for lack of a better word, humanize him more, to make him not just seem like a super dick, to not just be, this guy with powers who happens to hang around, to actually give him some sort of proper motivation to make him into a believable, fleshed-out, three-dimensional character, which, honestly, for a lot of the Silver Age, neither Superman nor much of his supporting cast really were. Their behaviors would be entirely dictated by the plot of whatever issue, and it often made no sense. How many times did Jimmy go get into quick, rich schemes or similar stuff that got him into huge trouble? And it doesn't make any sense that Jimmy's doing this in the context of, he's Superman's best friend. He's working for one of the most famous papers in the world. He's, in theory, one of the most famous photojournalists in the world. If he needs money that badly, just go get Superman to squeeze you some coal, man. He'll make diamonds. I mean, he won't. Money shouldn't be an issue for Silver Age Jimmy Olsen, is what I'm saying. He has all sorts of access to things and to people and to characters. So, yeah, but he on a dime, would just decide he needs to get rich. Or Superman would, on a dime, act one way one issue and on, completely differently another. And there was no consistency in character, and it all kind of didn't work. The way Superboy was written in the Silver Age didn't make sense in the context of him supposedly being Superman, who you're reading at the same time in other comics. This is supposed to have been his childhood, and it's all just a mess. And that was what Byrne had to clean up, and that was what they wanted to depower him, and they wanted to humanize him. They wanted to flip the script. They wanted Superman to be the mask, and Clark Kent to be the real person. And with good reason, because there's so much more storytelling opportunities there. If you have Superman as a character who essentially thinks of himself as human, he identifies as human. He's Kryptonian by genetics, but he's human by choice. He was raised by human parents, and indeed, in many versions of this story, he doesn't find out, as we're going to talk about, he doesn't find out about Krypton or any of that until he's an adult, until after he's become Superman even. So he grows up, he spends the first 18, 20 more years of his life having no idea who he is. I mean, obviously you'd think he would consider himself an alien, but you never know, and there are a history of superpowers in theory in this world, and the point is he doesn't know his heritage, and he doesn't really care. I mean, he cares, but more importantly, he knows who he is. He's Clark Kent. I mean, that is an actual line in Man of Steel where Clark is struggling with, after he does his first big thing on the scene, when he rescues the space shuttle, because in Man of Steel, that's how he makes his debut. He rescues the space shuttle that has Lois on it, and he reveals himself to the world, and he gets overwhelmed by the questions and the press, and it makes sense, because Clark, in this version, is has lived most of his life in a small town, has mostly kept under the radar. The one time in the book when he tries to push himself further, try and use his powers for his own ends, his Pa comes out and talks to him about it, and yeah, it makes sense that he would need this mask without wearing a mask to protect himself, and suddenly it gives the secret identity more value, because if he doesn't see himself as Clark Kent, then what's the point? I mean, really, when you look at it, why does Silver Age Superman, pretend to be Clark Kent? What is the point of it? What does he get out of it? If he needs a break, he's got an army of Superman robots. He's got a whole, jar full of miniature super Kryptonians who can and often will help out. He has a fucking super monkey he can go to. He has a cousin. He has lots of other people who can help him. So what is the point of Clark Kent if it's not something more than just a mask he wears? And so that's really the great accomplishment of Man of Steel was. It took this character who had become incredibly convoluted, not just in terms of, history, but in terms of character, and it simplified him. And it drove down to the core of the character. It drove down to the ideas that have always worked about Superman, and it added new elements that made him, I hate to use this term because it's a bit of a contentious term with some people, but it made him more relatable. It made him more understandable. It made him a better character. It let the book be as much about Clark Kent as it was about Superman, which in turn let the supporting cast around Superman develop more, because they were more important. They weren't just these people he puts up with because his secret identity happens to work there. They become friends. They become family. In Lois's case, they become something even more. And that is the brilliance of Man of Steel. What's especially interesting about Man of Steel is, unlike the other two stories I'm going to talk about, it's not really a complete story. It's really almost more an anthology, just happening to give us short stories set at various points in Superman's life. This is especially true in the early portions of the book, where we are watching Superman's childhood. We're watching some critical moments in his development. There is no overarching plot to Man of Steel. It is 6 issues. In some cases, the first couple issues having, telling half a story, like telling basically 2 stories, and then we get some full stories in the later issues, but they're all basically standalone, and they jump all over the place. Well, they don't jump all over the place. They keep jumping forward in terms of timeline. We see Superman make his initial debut. We see the first time he puts on the costume. Then we jump ahead to, really establishing the relationship with Jimmy and with Lois, and then we jump ahead a few years, literally a few years eventually. He's established himself. We see him meet Luthor. We see him meet Batman. All these different, somewhat critical moments, but still, it just kind of ends. The final issue has Superman finally, somewhat randomly really, find out about his Kryptonian heritage, and it sets the stage for some further plots down the line. And really, it makes sense, because unlike the other 2 stories, this wasn't designed really as a self-contained thing. It was meant to be a restart for the character and the continuity. But Byrne knew he was going to be taking over the book. He knew that he was going to be picking right up where this, series ends. I mean, maybe not literally in terms of the timeline, but he would be able to pick up a lot of, because there are a lot of lingering plot threads, if you read Man of Steel, which don't get resolved in the book itself. Like, for instance, when the Kents find Clark's, crashed thing, there's a mysterious watcher looking on, and the book never comes back to that. That was something that was picked up later on in the ongoing series, and there are all sorts of elements like that linger in the book. And this is not a complaint. It does arguably it hurts the book, I guess, in the longer term now, looking back at its legacy. But DC is wisely nowadays that, they've basically, the first 6 issues, the Man of Steel is basically treated as the first 6 issues of John Byrne's run, like they are. So the trade then, Volume 2, the next trade in the series, the most recent series that collects Byrne's run, just picks up with the ongoing. So it's not that big a deal. The point is, it's not an ongoing story, and because of that, arguably, you could say it might be the weakest. And it's also, it's aged intermittently. It's very well written, but it's definitely written in the tone and the style of an 80s superhero book, which, makes sense. That's when it was written, and that's what it is. Which means it's very wordy. Very, very wordy. There's a lot of tell instead of show. Or there's a lot of, we see Clark narrating what happened in flashback, or we see a lot of montages. So it's not, that may strike some people as a bit off, and it's definitely paced, and the characters, they speak out, there's a lot of monologuing, a lot of characters, repeating several times what they're thinking or feeling. I still think the book reads very well, though, and I think it remains an absolute classic. And really, Man of Steel is where the modern idea of Superman begins. And even with all the changes in the recent movie and in the New 52, much of that still lingers. Even Morrison, who, despite doing this arguably in All-Star Superman, even Morrison couldn't completely abandon the character of Clark Kent in his New 52 reboot. He certainly, his take certainly doesn't ignore the fact that on some level Superman cares about human beings. He's not some, in the Silver Age he did often come off as this kind of aloof, above it all, prepared to play with the mortals. He comes off like a god, like a Greek god almost. Really, somebody who can be part of the world but is above it as well, and can solve anything ultimately with his powers. And the modern Superman isn't like that. The modern Superman struggles. He still has, in some cases, unbelievable amounts of power, but that's not enough. He struggles with the right ways to use his powers. He struggles with, how much of my time can I give to being Superman? Because at the end of the day, I'm just a guy. In my own head, at least, I'm a guy, and I struggle, who am I? How am I going to have a life of my own? I have to have a life of my own, or else I'm going to go crazy. And there's some really just wonderful moments. One of the real highlights of the book is the issue where Superman and Batman first meet. Now, it might seem weird now that you devote an entire issue just to Superman and Batman having their first team-up, since there aren't really any other heroes who show up in this book. There's a lot of reasons for that, because at the time, the DC Universe wasn't as consistent. The Crisis reboot was not as consistent, perhaps, as it should have been, which is a trend that continues on to this day, I guess. And so there were a lot of characters in flux, but they made sure to include Batman. That's because the classic world's finest Superman, Batman, best buds. And this book puts a very firm, nail in the coffin of that idea, at least for the foreseeable future. The whole book is, the whole idea is it's a couple years into Superman's career, and he's come to Gotham to arrest Batman. And Batman, in the meantime, is dealing with a case with I believe a new villainess that Byrne created, the Magpie. She's your kind of typical Batman villain. She's got this disorder. She, like a magpie, she collects things and replaces it with other things, but unfortunately these things are deadly and they kill people and yada yada yada. She's fine. I mean, she serves the purposes of the story. There's a reason she hasn't gone on to be one of the great, additions to the Batman Rose Gallery, I think we could say. And basically Batman, he's trying to track her down. Superman just swoops down while he's swinging along the city, grabs the rope, and decides he's going to take Batman to jail. Batman, doesn't make it that easy for him, and, he drops down, manages to get away, manages to actually elude Superman for a short amount of time before revealing himself, and Superman goes, okay, nice tricks, guy, but ultimately I can take you down quicker than you can think. And Batman goes, I know. That's why I've set up a bomb somewhere in the city where, if you touch me, I'm surrounded by a force field. This is weird science, comic book science. It's not important. I'm surrounded by a field that, if you touch me, will disrupt it. It's cued to your unique whatever, and the bomb will go off and kill somebody. And Superman's horrified, and he goes, why would you do this? And Batman's like, I have to find the Magpie. I have to bring her to justice. You can help me. So reluctantly, Superman teams up. They end up taking down the Magpie, as you would expect. And at the end of the issue, by now you might be going, whoa, this is way out of character for Batman. Batman wouldn't plant a bomb or kill somebody. Was he bluffing? No, he wasn't bluffing, but as it turns out, in what is my favorite part, the bomb was on him. It was indeed strapped to somebody innocent, quote unquote. It was strapped to Batman. And Superman just gives him this look of like, my God, you're insane, or it's like, you're insanely dedicated, and Batman goes, I knew I had to, hold you at bay, I knew I couldn't fight you. This was before Kryptonite, basically, because Kryptonite gets introduced a couple issues down the line. So I came up with a way to buy me some time to show you that my form of justice is needed in Gotham, I'm needed in Gotham, and I couldn't just lie because you might be able to tell I was lying, you might be able to hear my heartbeat, and that's Batman, always thinking steps ahead. I really like this because you don't really get a fight between Batman and Superman, which, as I've talked about before, and it's one of the reasons I'm not looking forward to the upcoming movie, actual straight-on, physical fight between Batman and Superman is stupid. Because in reality, even holding back Superman, even if you go into the idea that Superman isn't trying to kill Batman, okay? Superman should still be able to end the fight really, really fast. And you can't even just say kryptonite, because it's not like Superman doesn't regularly go up against villains who have kryptonite. It's not like his archenemy isn't also a human being, a regular human being who happens to be an incredible genius and also has access to kryptonite. So, instead, what we get is, it's kind of a battle of wills, it's a battle of wits, and it's a battle of ideologies. And it plays out, and the interplay is really interesting, and it deliberately takes a different tack that they're not necessarily friends, they're not even really allies, they don't necessarily like each other, but they acknowledge that each of them needs to exist and the world needs them, and so they're going to have to tolerate each other for the foreseeable future. So, I'm not going to go into too much other detail in the rest of the individual stories. The weakest issue is definitely issue 5. That was where Byrne does his take on Bizarro, and it's very random, it's very strange. It throws in Lucy Lane, who was a recurring character pre-Silver Age, pre-reboot, pre-Crisis, and it's okay, where she's randomly been blinded, okay, and it's something that happened in between pages. She was never blind in the old continuity, and it's just a plot point to call back to the original Bizarro story. It's by far the weakest issue of the whole run, because it feels very forced and random. It is the issue that gives us the best action scene, probably, because it's the one issue where Superman really goes up against somebody else who has an equivalent level of power as him, and it's the issue where we really get an actual straight-on classic superhero fight. There's not a lot of that in Man of Steel, which makes sense, because this is really a character piece. It's an anthology, focusing on the character of Superman, I guess you could say. And there is action, there is some fighting, certainly, but it's not the focus of the book. The focus is establishing Clark and his world, and then establishing Lois and her world, and how the worlds come together. And that is something else that Byrne deserves a lot of credit for. His retooling of Lois is wonderful. He over the course of the 2 issues where we really get to see her in action, we get to see the lengths to which she will go to get a story. We see that she's clever, she's smart, she's no damsel at the same time. She does still, in some cases, need Superman's help, but she's definitely her own character, and a very interesting, complicated character. Byrne has a lot of fun with her fashion, which in retrospect is kind of hilarious. Like in one issue where we get the montage of seeing her trying to find Superman, she's wearing an outfit on every other panel, and it's like divided into a grid of panels, and it's all very 80s in terms of the fashion. I also have to say, by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how good the artwork in this book is. This was Byrne really at the height of his artistic powers, both in terms of writing and, in drawing, and he does a marvelous job with just, the character work, with the action, with just having Superman use his powers. When the big fight with Bizarro comes, it's engaging and fun. When, he had the job of redefining Krypton, which I'll get back to in a second, and he does a wonderful job of giving us a very different vision. He makes Lois look, incredibly attractive. You get why Clark would immediately fall for this woman, just on a... not to be shallow, but she's definitely very attractive, but she also, she's not just there for sex. She's not just, as happened a lot, in the past, she's not just Mary Jane posing provocatively on the cover. Let's go that way. There are some odd moments in Man of Steel, certainly. I like its take on Luthor, okay. That's the one area in terms of art where Byrne tries to do this thing where he's trying to show that, Luthor was a younger guy when Superman started out, and when we jump into the book, he's now older, and so he gives him hair at various points, but it kind of takes away from the menace. The way he gives Luthor hair just makes him more look almost clownish, and the way he makes him kind of heavy set, it doesn't work. And he's clearly trying to make Luthor both intimidating and also believable as somebody who rumors are going around Metropolis that he and Lois are a thing. And when you actually see the way Luthor looks, it's just like, no? I mean, he looks like he's twice Lois's age, and it's a weird design choice, and it doesn't really gel with later portrayals during Byrne's run and the writers who followed him, where Luthor is much more clearly of a same age as Perry White, and that becomes a very important plot point in the ongoing series, and all that stuff. So, still, Luthor, again, Luthor before this point was just the mad scientist. He was the guy who constantly got locked up in jail. He was, he could be dangerous, but he was definitely as much something of a clownish figure too, not deliberately, not in a Joker sort of way, but it was hard, I think, the way to put it is, you didn't take Luthor seriously. By the time of the reboot, it was hard to, because he'd just become, had been beaten so many times, and there'd been so many permutations of the character, and so many different takes on him, and he needed refreshing as much as Lois and Clark did, and Byrne nails that much. The idea of Luthor as the genius businessman, who builds himself up from nothing, it's the perfect take on the character, and it's one of the things I don't love. For instance, I mentioned earlier about All-Star Superman. I really don't like its take on Luthor. He makes it work more or less, but I find the businessman, the guy who has both the public and other face, some people say it's just a knockoff of Kingpin. Very loosely, that's like saying, Batman and Daredevil are the same. I find this is my favorite, the ruthless businessman Luthor, who's also prepared, if necessary, to get his hands a little dirty, which he isn't in this, but he will be in later on. That's probably my favorite take. So basically one that kind of combines aspects of both this and the earlier version of Luthor. But regardless, I think Byrne definitely nails the overall character, even if the look. The other biggest thing that Byrne did, and this was the stuff that would eventually get retconned out, I think, the most in later tellings, was he presented a very, very different take on Krypton. Before, Krypton was basically kind of goofy 60s sci-fi, space age, very, very recognizable to the Flash Gordon type. It was it was, like our world, only insane, only completely nutso. Science out the wazoo, and the take on Krypton we're given, it makes no sense in the Silver Age why nobody else really survived. And of course, I know lots of other people survived, but you know what I mean. The Krypton in the Silver Age, it makes no sense why Jor-El, at the time, only could send Clark to Earth. It makes no real sense, because they seemingly have lots of access to space stuff. Now, to be fair, this was something that was also being toyed with and being adjusted, pre-crisis in a number of issues, and you could see that, in another classic Alan Moore story for the man who has everything, but still, this Byrne really decided to just completely go the opposite direction. His Krypton, which we get to see in the opening pages. Now, unlike, say, Man of Steel the movie, we don't dwell on it too long. It's only a handful of pages. It's enough to set the scene, to give an idea of what Superman's homeworld was like, and then we move on to the heart of the story, because, again, Krypton is kind of irrelevant to Superman. It's important in terms of his backstory, but if you want to talk about who Superman is as a person, as a character, the key to Superman is Smallville. The key to Superman is the Kents. The key to Superman even is Metropolis and Lois and Jimmy and the other characters in his adult life. Krypton is this background element, but, it's not hard to picture a take on Superman, and indeed, as Man of Steel does, where he goes years, never finds out about Krypton. It doesn't, it opens storytelling avenues for the writer, but in terms of Superman, the character, him knowing where he came from, arguably isn't that important. And so you don't want to dwell too much on Krypton itself. You can have it as this element, you can bring it back up in the plot, but you really, when you're telling the origin of Superman, you want to get to Earth as soon as possible, because that's the important stuff. It's where the action is, as it were. So, the fact that Man of Steel, and I know, I can't help myself, I'm trying not to, dwell, but the fact that Man of Steel spends so much time on Krypton, it's an indulgence. It's a pointless indulgence when it would have been much better spending that time, maybe, further developing Pa and Ma so they don't come off as such, schizophrenic, off-paced characters, or maybe giving more time to the characters who actually really matter. It's nice you have Jor-El as a hologram, but again, you didn't really need that. There, moving on. So, Byrne decided to go very, I guess for lack of a better term, what I would call pseudo hard science. I mean, there's nothing hard science fiction about Superman. Though, part of what Byrne attempted to do, and he would do this over the course of his run, would be picked up by other writers, and you can see this in Man of Steel, but he at least tried to give some explanation for how Superman's powers works. For example, it doesn't make sense that Superman can actually pick up a plane, because if you actually stop and think about it, the plane would fall apart around him and he'd just be left with this one piece. So Byrne would introduce this idea gradually over the course of his run, and there's hints of it in Man of Steel. That's one of the lingering plot threads. That basically Superman has a form of tactile telekinesis. And he would also go with the idea that that was actually really the source of his powers, and other writers would somewhat play with that. That was what supposedly Superboy's powers later on during the reign of Superman, the clone of Superman, basically, who was for many years a wonderful, great character. I don't think he's even still around anymore now. I think he's... New 52, you've robbed us of so much. Anyways, so Byrne introduces the idea of Krypton as this sterile, kind of emotionless, lifeless place. A civilization that was once great and vibrant, but has retreated in on itself, to the point where, in what feels like, a deliberate nod to a similar idea in Asimov's classic robot detective novels, where touch is forbidden. People don't interact directly. When they talk at all, they do it over screens and monitors, and love is a foreign concept. Everything is sterile and driven by pure, cold, supposed logic. And in the brief few pages, we get the sense that Jor-El was a rebel, and that he actually had feelings for Lor-El, who was kind of shocked by it, but doesn't totally disagree with it. And the whole idea now is that he sees what's coming, but Krypton is so set and lost in its ways, they can't, and he only has time to save his son, who isn't technically born yet. Yeah, that's one of the big ideas that definitely got retconned out later on in various versions. You see, to Byrne, it didn't make any sense that you put a baby in a rocket ship and it could reach Earth at any period of time, and so instead of just saying like a warp drive or something like that, he came up with what he called the birthing matrix, where basically it was like, a stew of, his and Laurel's DNA, that didn't actually give birth to Clark until the rocket lands and is found by the Kents. It's not a bad idea. It's not a great idea. I have no problems with the idea, but I have no particular love of it either. It worked fairly well, but I can, I would have been fine if it stuck around, but other writers wanted to go with a more classic take, so fine. Yeah, that is basically Krypton. And it comes back in Man of Steel. Basically, Clark, as I said, he goes throughout Man of Steel not really knowing who he is. Eventually, later on, in I believe the second issue, Pa Kent, when he's about 16 or 17, he started to use his powers to become a football star and all that. He finally shows Clark the rocket ship. So the idea is that Clark knows he has these powers, but he doesn't know where they come from. Now, one of the weird elements of Man of Steel, this is one of the elements that doesn't age very well, is that apparently the Kents and Clark never make the connection with the idea that he might be an alien. Until the last issue, Clark apparently thinks, and so do his parents, they think that he is like some sort of mutant or an experiment from Russia. Now, at the time, remember, this was released in the 80s, and the idea was, it was released in the mid-80s, and that we are seeing the DC Universe now. So that when Clark Kent landed, it would have been in the 60s, and so the idea that they would associate with a crashed rocket with the Russians is fine. That part, I guess. But once he started developing powers, and once you see how advanced the technology is, but it's a weird element, but fine, I can go along with it. So they show him the rocket, they show him that he is not, he's not what he thought he was, and that's basically it. It's not until the last issue where he returns back to Smallville. He's been having a bit of a stressful time. Things aren't necessarily going great. He needs a conversation. He runs back into Lana Lang. The book doesn't do great by Lana, though. There's a lot of struggle with that character in all three of these series, honestly. I mean, it early on, it does some fun stuff with Lana, making her, this kind of supporting character to Clark's life. And remember, this is a version of Clark where there was no Superboy, but then it eventually reveals that he showed her his powers, and he showed her all this, but he showed her right before he was leaving. And apparently, when we pick back up several years later, and he's now Superman, he's back, and he sees Lana, the idea is that this ruined Lana's life. And it's like, you showed me a world, and then you took it all away from me, and you left me broken and in despair. I thought we were going to be together, and yeah, that part hasn't really aged well. I get what Byrne was going for. I think he was kind of trying to go for, it's a similar idea that Doctor Who has toyed around with like the companions, what happens to his companions after they move on with their lives, but it doesn't really come off. He tries very hard, and there's a bit of it's not a word for it, a bit of a sexism to it. It's not intentional, but it's still there. Regardless, he has a conversation with Lana, and they tentatively reestablish their friendship. And then he goes to see the rocket, and the rocket decides now to activate, and he gets flooded with knowledge from Krypton. It's basically trying to rewrite his personality, rewrite his mind. And this will become a plot point, a major plot point later on in the book after Byrne's left. They'll use this to introduce the character of the Eradicator, and that leads into the reign of Superman. And this is a very important moment, basically, in the whole, up until the next reboot in the, background of Superman's life. And Pa basically saves him by smashing it, and Clark flies off after thanking him, and we get this long monologue. And the book definitely ends on a bit of an anticlimax. The final few pages are him just flying around and then randomly going up into the Arctic, and it's clearly meant to be a callback, to the old Fortress of Solitude, but it's not like he actually builds it or anything. Regardless, he's thinking to himself, and at the end he comes to the conclusion, I don't care where I'm from, I know who I am, I'm Superman, but really I'm Clark Kent, I am of Earth, and I'm going to protect this planet. And that's Man of Steel. The other big addition, also, I've mentioned them several times, is Mom Pa Kent. If you don't know, in the Silver Age, and this is sadly something that's gotten picked back up in the New 52, it was also introduced partially through Jeff Johns, and it's not something I like. Maybe it's just that this isn't my Superman, but in Byrne's take, Mom Pa live. They remain alive into, as Superman begins his career. Well, in the Silver Age, they die. They die when he's still Superboy. It's actually, their death is actually one of the better Silver Age stories. I mean, it's still got some of that forced, contrivances and a bit of wackiness, but overall, the message of it is at least the classic version, there've been, Silver Age would retell a lot of different stories, but the best version of it is basically they get infected with an alien virus that after, Clark tries to take them on a trip, and he tries to use his powers and abilities to save them. Technically he might have been able to travel in time, but let's leave that alone because it messes with the plot. The idea is supposed to be he can't save them even with all his powers, all his abilities, and they die. And he's humbled by it, and he realizes that despite everything he can do, he is still, he still has limits. Which is nice in theory, it's just in practice that's bullshit. Like I said, Superman had no limits in the Silver Age, and he could have traveled back in time, and he could have found a million different ways. He was friends in Superboy. Superboy was part of the Legion of Superheroes. You telling me he couldn't go into the future with the Legion but fine. It's a nice idea, but I do appreciate it in theory, but I like even more the idea of having Mom Pa back at home as this kind of human element that remains as confidants, for example, that Clark can go to. People who really, especially if we're talking about at a time when nobody else knows his identity, except maybe Lana, before he and Lois have gotten together, especially in that kind of setup. It's good to have somebody around who knows his identity, who he can confide in, who can be, his sounding board, in the same way that Alfred makes such a great supporting character in Batman. Basically, in Byrne's take, that's what Mom Pa can't become. They become Clark's Alfred. Not literally. They don't dust up the super cave or anything like that. But they become part of what gives him perspective. And they became very important plots. Like I said, I mentioned the whole idea that, that the Eradicator would get introduced, and that, Krypton would try and overwrite the memories of Clark. And it was something that Smallville would pick up on, and other things have. That idea got explored in a really great storyline, which brought us the Eradicator. It gave us a really fun Lobo-Superman fight. I think it was their first actual fight. And this was back before Lobo had been hideously overexposed and was actually, a real honest-to-God legitimate threat to Superman. And the conclusion of the story is Mom Pa, helping Clark find his humanity again. And it's really one of my favorite Superman stories. There was a trade of it years ago, but I'm sure that's long gone out of print, but if you can find it, I think it's called Superman Eradicator or Superman Eradication. Regardless, that is overall Man of Steel, and I think, like I said, not every element is aged well, and it's not great that it can't tell a cohesive story. In retrospect, you look at Batman Year One. that actually does have a beginning, middle, and end. Now, I would argue that in some ways Man of Steel is more effective than Year One, at least in terms of building Superman's world and establishing everything about it, because Year One literally is just like half of the origin of Batman, if even that. So many elements are just left up in the air, and which is especially problematic for the writers, because the book was going to pick... It wasn't like the Batman books were going to pick up right where Year One ended, no. So, whether that's a flaw or not is a debate, but that is actually why I've come to kind of like something like Year Zero better, where it gets to show us an early Batman, or put Year Zero together with... If you don't know, Year Zero was a 12-issue... storyline that Scott Snyder has done in the course of his seminal run. It is now one of my all-time favorite Batman stories. I think you read that in Year One back to back, and you have an interesting little mix on the different takes of Superman's origin. But regardless, Batman's origin. Sorry. Let's get back on Superman. So I think in some ways Year One, is a better story on its own, but I think Man of Steel does a better job setting the stage for Superman, setting up everything, while also telling stories that for the most part do work as short tales or individual beats on their own. I mean, that Superman-Batman issue just works great completely as a story of Batman and Superman meeting. There's nothing else you need to know. And more importantly, Byrne, as I said, he humanized Superman in a way that was incredibly compelling and would basically become the backbone of so many different takes. The animated DC universe, even the current Man of Steel takes, any version of Superman you've seen, except maybe for something like, I don't know, Morrison's All-Star Superman. But certainly in other media, so many takes on Superman, our idea of Superman today, so much of it has its origins here in Man of Steel. And even if the continuity doesn't matter anymore, that doesn't, who cares? Yes, all of this is out of continuity. Yes, this has all been retconned. Yes, the New 52 has tried its damnedest to discard pretty much all of this, thanks to the confused mess of what they've done with the reboot and everything. But this still lingers on, and it's going to come back in favor. The idea of Superman, where the man is as important, if not more so than the Superman, begins really, I think, in Man of Steel. And for that alone, it remains a must-read for fans of the characters. If you want to see how Superman should be, if you want to see a take on Superman that highlights his humanity, that shows you can make him be this powerful figure, who can do all sorts of things, and you can still tell compelling stories. This idea that Superman isn't relatable, can't be relatable, is bullshit. You can absolutely give him all these powers and still make him a compelling character, not just in the, not just in the aspirational take, okay? Which is a fine take, and I don't want to come off like I hate All-Star Superman. I don't. One of the finest moments in Superman history is that little bit on the ledge with the suicidal girl. It just sums up everything that makes Superman a wonderful character. A character who is still relevant today, FYI. Is still important, maybe even more important than ever. An immigrant who shows that how important it is. I don't hate All-Star Superman, but it's not my preferred take on the character. I fell in love with Superman in the aftermath of Man of Steel. I didn't start reading until several years after Byrne had left, but I did go back and get Byrne's run once I started to get into the character, into that take in the character, and I've been a fan. John Byrne has become something of a pariah with a lot of people, and with good reason. He's said a lot of awful, stupid things. He has some views that I am very much opposed to, and just even as a creator, he's not what he once was. Oh, he can still knock out a good story now and then, and actually he's been doing on and off for, coming 5-6 years now, a bunch of Star Trek comics with IDW. Like, he did a really fun miniseries focusing on Dr. McCoy, kind of like, it was your medical procedural only starring Dr. McCoy in the future, and it was a fun book, but even when you read it, his writing, and especially his art, just isn't what it once was. Art, an artist evolves as they go along, sure, but this doesn't feel like an evolution. This doesn't feel like he's drawing that way because he's choosing it. It feels like he's drawing that way because, he can't do what he used to do. But regardless, he does remain a very important creator in the history of comics, and I don't think it's overstating to say that DC Comics today would probably not be recognizable in any way, shape, or form, even after all the reboots, without John Byrne. Eventually, may it be many years from now, because I do not wish the man ill, eventually when John Byrne passes away, there's going to need to be huge tributes from both Marvel and DC to the man, because he really was very important to both companies. And he really did do a lot of great work in his day. And Man of Steel is definitely some of his best. Go and read it if you've never done so. Yes, the outfits can be a little silly at times. Yes, there's a lot of talky. Yes, it's not really a complete story in its own right. But the power that is the origin of Superman when done right remains in this book. And showcasing how Superman can be a compelling character even once he has all his powers. Because half this book is basically Superman, showing the early stages and later, of his career. And it's a great book. The characters are compelling, and you can totally... And this is the Lois Lane I fell in love with. This is the Clark Kent I fell in love with. This is, to a degree, the Lex Luthor I fell in love with. This is the beginning of what remains for me my Superman. A character who is someone you can idolize, but also somebody you can on some level understand. You can understand the fact that he knows, in theory, he can do more, but there is still only so much he can do. I mean, that's the thing about Superman that always gets me, is the thought of he can hear probably everything that's going on in Metropolis. And that means he can hear all sorts of bad things, and he knows he can't intervene in every single thing. He'd go insane trying. He would fail. But there's a part of them that wants to try anyways, and it's not that I want him to be emo. I don't want him to be, just angsting, and this book isn't Superman angsting, but I do like to see that, his real okay, you're going to think this is cheesy, but his real vulnerability isn't kryptonite. It's the fact that in his head and in his heart, he's a human being, and what that means for someone with the powers of a god. So, there you go. That is my thoughts on Man of Steel, bit of my rambling thoughts. I'll try to be a little bit more focused for the next two books, and that is where we're going to end things for now. As I said, this is going to be the start of a 3-part series. I'm not quite sure when the next 2 parts will be coming out. I think part 2 will come out next week, and then part 3 will probably come out the week after, but part 3 might be delayed by a couple weeks, because I have some game reviews I also have to do, and I wanted to get the podcast back up and started. I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you continue to enjoy what's coming. And as I said, I will be bringing back the podcast. I've definitely got a lot of thoughts on things like the Chronicles of Shannara, the return of superhero TV in form of Agent Carter, Flash, Arrow, and of course Legends of Tomorrow. I'm planning some reviews of some ancillary Doctor Who material, including the new War Doctor audio drama, and also the 3-part Glamour trilogy, which were 3 books released in 2015, starring the 12th Doctor. So there's definitely more stuff coming in. As I said, game reviews, Mario and Luigi Paper Jam is coming, Naruto, Ninja Storm 4 Ultimate, I can't remember the name right now, I'm sorry, Project X Zone 2, Digimon Cyber Sleuth. I'm really bad with names. I'm kind of like, this is my first time back, and I'm burning out a bit. I do apologize. Anyways, more coming. I'm back. I keep saying that. Hopefully I actually mean it for real this time. Fingers crossed. And yeah, if you want to continue to support the show, if you want to see more from me, you can head on over to unrepentantgeeking.com. There are a whole host of past reviews, past podcasts, Monsters October, all sorts of goodies that you can check out. I did a roundtable back in December with Oda and Petros Elanu of My Life as a Video Game, taking a look at The Force Awakens, and yeah, so you can also support the show over at patreon.com/unrepentantgeeking. Just $1 or $2 a month would be a big help keeping the lights on around here, keeping things going. And if you are watching this via iTunes, then you can leave a review and rating. It would really help. It spreads the word about the show, and it doesn't cost you anything. It's a way you can support the show without spending a dime. The same if you are watching this via video, Twitter, Facebook, all that good stuff. Just please spread the word. I really do appreciate it. Alright, well then, until next time, for Unrepentant Geeking and Channel Awesome, I am Sean Cronenfeld, wishing you all long days and pleasant nights.